Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar about the implications of the war in Gaza and the Middle East. The event is hosted by my research group, DEMOS, the Democracy, Migration and Society Group, and I'm very happy to say that we have here many participants, more than 90 people who signed up, both students and faculty from Aalborg University, but also from other places and other universities in France, the UK, and also the Netherlands. It's really great to be able to provide such a space. Our guest speaker today is Joseph Daher. Joseph is, before everything, he's a dear friend and comrade that I met in Switzerland, in Geneva, some years ago. And Joseph is a Syrian academic and activist. He teaches at University of Lausanne and the European University Institute in Florence. His research focused on the Middle East. Joseph is the author of two books, Syria After the Uprising, The Political Economy of State Resilience, and Hezbollah, The Political Economy of Lebanon Parties of God. Thank you so much, Joseph, for joining us. So, as you know, the situation in Gaza is beyond any description in terms of, and there is no word actually that could describe the violence, the cruelty, and that we are witnessing. Basically, it's a live stream genocide. 30,000 people have been killed. Almost half of them are children. 8,000 are women. 69,000 are injured, without counting those who are still missing. I think there are around 7,000. 1.5 million people are condensed in Rafah and being displaced and should be displaced and are facing inhuman conditions and a constant threat of being killed because there is no safe place in Gaza. We are talking about starvation and spread of disease. People start actually dying of hunger and also missing the necessary treatments. I mean, people especially with chronic disease, but also new disease, since all hospitals have been, infrastructure has been bombed and destroyed by Israeli army. Of course, as we see also the aid is not allowed to enter. I mean, only small amounts that could not, answer the needs. At the same time, we are also witnessing an escalation of the tensions between Hezbollah and Israel in the southern Lebanon. Also in Syria, Damascus was targeted yesterday, but this is not a single targeting. It has been going on for some time right now. We also see the Houthi rebel in Yemen attacking ships that goes to Israel in the Red Sea, and as a response, Israel and the US were bombing them. Iran is often called out as the main head and sponsor behind those movements of armed resistance. I mean, Egypt is also have implication, the Gulf countries, and also North Africa. So it seems like the whole region, the Middle East and also North Africa are actually or have implications, or what is happening in Gaza has implication on the whole region, but also if we want to say, it also has implication on the world in general. So Joseph, today we'll be talking specifically about the implication of the war on Gaza in the Middle East. I will thank you. So Joseph, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Amira, first of all, to welcoming me, and thank you all to attending this event. Hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion, because what I think is the most important is to discuss this issue, which unfortunately, whether regarding the Palestinian issue or more widely the Middle East, has become an issue, especially to even discuss about it. And therefore, I'm thankful to have this possibility to discuss this today. As Amira was saying, it's hard to speak of all the implications of the Israeli war in Gaza on the Middle East region, and we could potentially do also what are the implications on international political affairs, because this war has not only remained, in its political implications in the region, but more widely. We see for example, the consequences on the Democrat Party and the US elections in the US. We can see how Russia is trying to instrumentalize, obviously, the Palestinian affairs by welcoming various political parties, Palestinian political parties, for already to start discussing of the day after, while we're still in the middle of the war. Also, its political implications in Europe. We've seen, for example, a minister in Great Britain having to resign following Palestinian demonstrations, internal disagreements with the police, etc. Similar in France, we've seen also political implications. So again, I think the scale, we cannot yet understand the scale of the consequences of this war, of the Israeli war on Gaza and more generally the Palestinian yet. Most probably it will be of the scale of the first Nakba, the first catastrophe in 1948 following the creation of the State of Israel, which led to the forced displacement of over 80% of the Palestinian people, and has been not only a punctual event in history, but a continuation. And I think what we're witnessing today in Gaza is a form of continuation of the Nakba. And as also the ICG is pointing out, genocidal acts, etc. But during our talk, I'll try to limit myself to the Middle East by coming back first on what were the objectives. I won't go into details about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I think you know it all. Amira has mentioned it, but nearly 85 to 90% of the population is displaced, living in catastrophic, I would say, tragic situation. But I'm happy to go back in the discussion. But let's concentrate on, the political implications. Again, this is the topic of the day. First of all, maybe on Hamas objectives following the 7th October operation. First of all, I think we shouldn't undermine that it was a reaction to the Israelis' violence against Palestinians, and it has been announced on a couple of interviews or statements prior even to the 7th October that a reaction would happen. Hamas said it regarding what happened in Jerusalem, Salwan neighborhood, the siege on the Gaza Strip, what is occurring in the West Bank, etc. Secondly, political objectives by Hamas to become once again, if you want, the leading political party on the Palestinian political scene and further marginalizing the Palestinian Authority that is already very weak. And this action has definitely put it back, on the top of most probably the Palestinian political scene. Although, feelings are very much different when it comes to Gaza Strip, where I think the polarization for and against Gaza has been increased after the 7th October and the consequences of it, while we can see in the West Bank and more generally in the Palestinian scene, refugees especially, higher popularity. I can discuss a bit about it, but I was 2 weeks ago in Lebanon for research, and this is very clear when you go in Palestinian refugee camps and discussions. This has been growing. So this is, I think, the second political objective. And obviously, the third political objective was, derailing the so-called normalization process between Israel and regional countries, especially Saudi Arabia. And this has temporarily worked, even though, and I'll come back to this, I think it's a temporary suspension, while Saudi Arabia has made a strategic choice regarding the normalization process. But I'll come back to this. These were Hamas objectives, let's say. What has been Israeli objective? And this, there's a difference, I think, there's a gap between the official rhetoric and what is happening on the ground. And even among, there's been a survey among Israelis lately saying basically they're not sure anymore of the objectives of the war and that they don't believe that this war can be won according to Israeli objectives. Israeli objectives have been several. First, they claim to free the hostages. This is definitely not, there's no consensus among Israeli ruling elite, even among the government. The most extremist, sectors of the Israeli government has said it's not a top priority. And the actions of the Israeli state show that it's not a top priority. And actually some hostages have died because of Israeli bombardments, etc. Second, to destroy Hamas. Well, history has taught us, and I always take this example. I was in Lebanon in 2006, had to leave the war, had to leave the country because of the war, you don't destroy a political party, especially whether we like it or not. Personally, I'm opposed politically to Hamas, just as I am to Hezbollah, but you don't destroy a political party by basically launching a war against it, especially a military war. On the opposite, Hezbollah came out of the war in 2006 much more successful, much more popular. And I'm afraid that is what we will witness, I was mentioning regarding Hamas. And even there have been latest information that Hamas has been able to pay the local police forces in different areas of the Gaza Strip just in the past few days, and even state employees of the Gaza Strip. When I mean state employees, employees of the Hamas administration in the Gaza Strip. And even among, certain Israeli political and military elite, this objective is more and more in doubt. Finally, the latest objective, which I think is connected to what I was talking about and is important to understand, is the continuation of what has occurred in 48, the Nakba, because of the nature of the Israeli state, which is a settler colonial state. So the comparison is not, for example, with South Africa. It's more with the US, Canada, Australia, meaning, you have to forcefully displace or ethnically cleanse the indigenous population. And this, we have seen calls by even Israeli, ministers, etc., that, Sinai should be a good place for them, or that, various Western countries should welcome this numbers of Palestinians. And actually, when you see the military plans, actions of the Israeli occupation army, they're doing everything to prevent any future life in Gaza in terms of infrastructures, etc. So here we have a mix of objectives. Some are rather rhetoric, others are, I would say, rather being implemented in the practice. But nevertheless, Israeli state is lacking, future, except the objective of, ethnic cleansing is lacking political objectives. And this is why I would say there's disagreements with its main sponsor, US ally. And I come back to this later on. This does not mean that I rather disagree with some commentators when they say there's strong pressure from Washington and Israeli state. No, on strategic basis, they agree. It's on tactical issues they disagree. Otherwise, the Israeli war on Gaza would not have been able to sustain until today, whether politically, by the veto of the US and United Nations, but more importantly, because of the US military assistance until today to the Israeli state. This is, and now we come to the regional implications. Obviously, this Israeli war has shown on the Palestinians, has shown one thing, that many, political analysts, some political analysts would say, even the US were in the process of publishing a document before 7th of October, saying the Middle East hasn't been that stabilized for more than a decade. Well, this has been proven absolutely wrong. It was already wrong, but moreover after the 7th of October. And another element, I remember discussions prior 2023 regarding the consequences of the normalization process, that the Palestinian issue is not anymore a key issue for the region based on the normalization process. This has shown once again completely wrong. There's the popularity of the Palestinian issue is still very much important within the region, I would say. And again, if we look at international implication, also throughout the world, there's a further consensus regarding the Palestinian issue, not only in what we call the so-called Arab world or the Middle Eastern or North African region, but throughout the world. And more, I think the biggest proof of this is the US, among the US youth, etc. Quite interesting to see this kind of dynamics. And also there was, so these are two first indicators that I think is interesting to speak out. But the first, the kind of major consequences has been obviously, if we look at the normalization processes, Saudi Arabia's and Israel especially, this have been suspended for the moment. I believe it's temporary. And what I think the consequence of this war is that Saudi Arabia has to raise the conditions to reach for a normalization process for Israel. The main difference, I would say, between Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies, such as, for example, Qatar and the UAE, especially, they have to deal with a popular opinion. Therefore, the kind of agreement they will conclude in the future with Israel need to satisfy partially some of this popular opinion, which, when you look at Qatar, less than 5% of the population is indigenous. UAE, quite similarly, 5-10%, maybe 10% is indigenous. It's less, it's kind of, you don't take this first into consideration. Saudi Arabia has to, in its foreign policy, it has to deal with a national popular opinion that is quite sympathetic towards the Palestinian. And actually, Saudi elite has been worried of further popularity expressed on social medias towards even Hamas by Saudi youth, and especially became very important throughout, some of the Arabic youth. Or when I was in Lebanon, the two main personalities that you would see in pictures are Abu Ubaidah, Mohammed Deif. So Hamas military porte-parole, natiq rasmi, spokesperson, sorry, and the head of the military Hamas brigade. So the normalization process has been suspended, and Saudi Arabia has republished different statements stating that any kind of normalization process will have to go through a two-state solution, Jerusalem as a capital, East Jerusalem, etc. So this is the official position, but would Saudi Arabia wait until this is implemented? Or if a paper is just, put forward pointing towards this direction, I think it's more the second choice. Because again, I really believe that Saudi Arabia, because of the major changes in its political economy, seeking to welcome, major investments regarding tourism, welcoming more than now 150 million tourists by 2030, and also its willingness to find and that it shares with other regional countries to re-implement a form of authoritarian stability in the region, stopping meaning, wars, regional uprising, jihadist threat, etc. It shares with other actors. So this is one of the consequences. The second consequences, it has consolidated the form of rapprochement, even though still, being taken step by step, but between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We had the first visit of an Iranian president to Saudi Arabia, Raisi, to Saudi Arabia, since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the last Iranian president to visit Saudi Arabia. We've seen common statement made by Saudi Arabia in Iran, we've seen in the Islamic Organization Summit, appearing together, and various kind of statements. Similarly speaking, and we'll come back to this later on, is the behavior of Iran and the Houthis in Yemen. Houthis have stopped since, the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to target, and had started before, but to be a threat, basically, to Saudi Arabia, to its oil unit production, while at the same time, Saudi Arabia has not made any comments regarding what is occurring in Yemen, has not joined US-led multi-naval force that has been established since the end of December, targeting also Houthis force. Saudi Arabia has remained quite silent, or saying, it's creating more instability, therefore it's not welcome. So these are interesting issues to witness. And now we come to a second level, and this will allow me also to do a kind of cartography of the region and the neighboring countries of Palestine, is the issue of Iran. Iran has on multiple times stated that it doesn't want a regional war. And I believe so, and I have been saying this, that Iran was not aware, neither the Hezbollah and Lebanon was aware of the operation that was being prepared by Hamas on 7th October. And obviously, Hamas has benefited from the military expertise, military support, financial support, political support of Iran, but Hamas remains, a Palestinian actor with some forms of autonomy, and this decision was made on its own. And actually, you've seen, and I've heard, you've seen even publicly, some Hamas officials, notably Khalid Mishal, but also another one. Khalid Mishal is a charge, if you want, of the funding of Hamas outside. He was the former head of the political bureau of Hamas, say that they were expecting more from Iran and Hezbollah and their allies regarding, after the 7th of October. But Iran has always seen, and this must be very clear.
Okay.
We have to make a difference. Okay. Is it fine? Yeah. We have to make a difference between the official rhetoric of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its political objectives. Iran is not at all seeking to liberate Palestine, but Palestine, and more particularly Hamas in this case, is an additional tool in its hands regarding, regional and international negotiations, whether being able to pressure various regional actors or internationally. And this is what we witnessed since the 7th of October. It made use of its network of influence that it has been able to build for the past 3 or 4 decades, if we go back to Hezbollah in Lebanon, grown massively after the US occupation of Iraq in Iraq, stronger relations with the Houthis since the 2000s, but especially following Saudi military intervention in Yemen in 2015, and on and off with Hamas since the beginning of the 90s. Obviously, there's differences within this relationship. But what is important to understand, and I think these are one of the strengths of Iranian foreign policy, it has been able to kind of build a network of influence to be used in various regional and international negotiations, and to pressure as well. And this is what I think we witnessed since the 7th of October. And now let me go kind of country to country. First of all, Syria. Syria has seen consequences directly of the 7th of October, but some things are not new. Amira, you were mentioning that, for example, 2 days ago, Israel bombed a Damascus neighborhood, Kafr Sousa, but this has been ongoing since 2015, 2016. What we witness an increase in is the targeting of Iranian generals of the Pasdaran, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, of the Quds Force, since especially December. So more and more targets against this kind of Iranian Revolutionary Guards within Syria, or targeting of what have been considered military bases, or hosting, Iranian commanders or pro-Iranian militias. But not only, because between October to January, for example, Aleppo and Damascus airports have been shelled several times also by the Israeli state. But moreover, something that not a lot of analysts have talked about is the 7th of October and afterwards was also an opportunity for the Syrian regime to increase its bombing on the northwest and Idlib areas. Actually, they used as a pretext, because at the beginning of October, there was an attack on Homs military academy during a celebration by most probably a drone coming from HTS areas, so Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a jihadist, former jihadist organization, at least a Salafist jihadist organization, that killed over 89 individuals. the Syrian regime used this pretext to launch new attacks, but it continued further on until end of December, killing more than 100 people, mostly civilians, and displacing by force 120,000 people in the northwest. Similarly, the Turkish state took the pretext of an attack of a PKK soldier on a Ministry of Interior Defense in Istanbul to launch new attacks, severe attacks on the northeast, and especially what is called the Autonomous Administration of the Northeast, which is considered to be controlled or dominated by the PYD, which is considered the sister organization of the PKK, considered a terrorist organization by Turkey. But again, because of the people, the world basically looking more what is happening in Gaza, they increased their attacks. So they targeted civilians, many infrastructures. 50% of electricity units were out for a while because of targeting infrastructures. Also, during the year 2023, nearly more than 200 civilians have been killed through Turkish airstrikes, drones, etc. So they also increased the attacks. And actually, and this is something I come back into conclusion, but the impunity that has been permitted towards the Israeli state for the past 75 years has de facto benefited also regional actors and authoritarian regimes. So there's a connection here we can see. So this was mostly happened to Syria, and this will make my transition with Iraq. Similarly, you had pro-Iranian militias, whether in Syria or in Iran, targeting even more than before 7th of October, US military camps as a pressure on these US military base within Syria, in the northeast, and in Iraq. For a reminder, you have around 30,000 US soldiers in the Middle East, the biggest military bases in Qatar, over 10,000 people. But in Syria, you have around 900 US soldiers, and in Iraq, around 2,500 US soldiers. And you had pro-Iranian militias, targeting these US military camps in an attempt to push them out of these countries. And it escalated, especially in the end of January, beginning of February. The US targeted 85 kind of targets within Syria and Iraq, targeting pro-Iranian militias, following the death of 3 US soldiers in a US base at the border with Jordan and Syria that were killed following the launching of a drone by pro-Iranian militias. But on both sides, it was clear that they didn't want to push more for a real, regional war. When I say this, obviously I'm taking into account Middle Eastern indicators or measures. If we were in Europe, we would already be speaking of a regional war. But unfortunately for the Middle East, this kind of violence have been nearly normalized for the past decade. So it's still, kind of tit for tat. Actually, following the death of 3 US soldiers, the main group, the pro-Iranian militia group that did this action, the Kata'ib Hezbollah, which is an Iranian pro-Iranian militia, had stated they would stop action against Iran. Afterwards, because they killed one of its general, the US, it said it might start again, but there have been different statements by Iranian officials to say to its network of influence, various militias, we have to come down the game. We don't want any kind of regional war. So you've seen in Iraq also further escalations of violence. And actually, Iraq has been what we call very often in French, une boîte aux lettres, for meaning, a postal box for Iraq, for the US and Iran to answer each other. So when Iran wants to answer to the US, it usually targets Iraqi Kurdistan and targets the so-called claim to be Israeli spies or Israeli, military centers. The last target, the last bombing of Iranian bombing, of Kurdistan, Iraq, killed several Iraqi Kurdish businessmen in Kurdistan, in Erbil. And therefore, unfortunately, once again, it's the civilian being mostly suffering from this kind of escalation of tension between the US and Iran. And this is also creating a sense, just like in Syria, of two countries that used to have, kind of quite an important geopolitical stance prior to the 2000s, before US occupation, before the war in Syria in 2011, that are now very weak regimes, very passive regime when it comes to foreign policies, and are suffering actually proxy wars by various regional actors. So creating further, I would say, frustration among the population, in addition to high level of poverty, corruption, privatization, austerity measures, etc. Now I go to Yemen. As we all know, Yemen has also, been a center of what, if you want, the results of the 7th of October, especially through the group that is called Houthis or Ansar Allah, that actually started to try to launch rockets on the south of Israel, and so it wasn't really very effective, and started targeting boats that were transporting particular products towards Israel. So they have targeted more than 25 boats that was transporting particular products. In reaction to this, because the Red Sea is basically, you have over 12% of the world trades that go through it. We saw that the US wanted, therefore, to securize this, to consolidate security in this region, therefore consolidated a US-led multinational level force to counter Houthis force. And this only increased actually the frustration, the regional frustration among the population, saying basically, people criticizing the fact that the US is very rapid in reacting and creating a multinaval force against the Houthis, while not being able to do anything regarding the Palestinians. So this only, reinforced this feeling of double standard that we already knew existed, but only deepened. And therefore, the Houthis never, despite the various bombing, targeting of US and British forces especially, have continued their actions, and they said they will stop until there's a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. This brings me to the last, I think, country that is key also to understanding the unwillingness of Iran to launch a more important reaction towards Israeli action, Israeli war on the Palestinian Gaza, is Lebanon. Lebanon, as you know, the most important political actor is Hezbollah, that has been created in the mid-80s, and it is most probably and more certainly the greatest success of the export of the Khomeini's Islamic revolution in the region. Until today, Hezbollah is ideologically connected and linked to the Islamic Republic of Iran through the Wilayat al-Faqih, and is massively funded by also the Wilayat al-Faqih. So directly the supreme guide of the of the Islamic Republic of Iran, obviously it also supported militarily, politically, and therefore economically. And Hezbollah has become the most important political actor in Lebanon by its military branch, by its civilian infrastructures, what I call the kind of Hezbollah civil society that basically helps consolidate its hegemony on the Shia population of Lebanon, but what helps as well in its discourse and that in practice as well, help its society of resistance, basically. This said, and despite the rhetoric of Hezbollah, about, struggling against Israel, Israel has not been, the key priority of the party now for more than a decade. Actually, we've seen the most important intervention since 2006, I would say, of Hezbollah military in Syria to assist, the Syrian regime in repressing massively and bloodily the Syrian people uprising, and this even before the rise of jihadist, Salafist jihadist force. So from the 2012. This is not to say that Hezbollah's armed branch and resistance doesn't do anything against Israel. It is, but Hezbollah has claimed since the beginning of September, October, that they will remain a front of pressure, a support front, a front of pressure for the Palestinians. This claim is, in my view, we can put some question marks, because I don't believe that this front of support, as they claim it, has been able to slow down or diminish the pressure on the Palestinians in Gaza, as we can see on a daily basis. Why so? To remain in a position that is measured, calculated, and even has broad criticism from its own popular basis. Well, first, again, Hezbollah is seeing the issue in a much broader geopolitical perspective first. Iran as well does not want to see the most important actor in its nexus of influence, its network of influence, which is Hezbollah, its crown jewel of influence, being weakened. Because if Hezbollah is weakened, therefore Iran is weakened, and the opposite is true as well. So they share interest. But again, Hezbollah is not only a proxy force. It is an autonomous Lebanese national movement that share also political interest with the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is important to understand. And actually, Hezbollah's significance in the network of influence of Iran has only grown in this past decade, and more especially following the death of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Pasdaran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, in 2020 in Baghdad, because Hezbollah, and especially Hezbollah officials, have been able to play an intermediary role between Islamic Republic of Iran and various actors of its network and influence. We've seen Hezbollah officials, for example, play an intermediary role among Iraqi pro-Iranian militias following the elections, trying to find settlements between them because there were tensions. We also seen Hezbollah played a key role in the kind of reconsolidation of links, but that remained very cold, between the Syrian regime on one side and Hamas, the Palestinian Hamas, on the other side. As a reminder, Hamas left Syria at the beginning of 2012 because it refused to officially support the Syrian regime in its repression against the Syrian population. So Hezbollah was again the intermediary. So this is one thing, the geopolitical perspective, the more broader issue. Second of all, it's also linked to internal causes. Hezbollah does not benefit from the similar support that it had in 2006. To put it bluntly, after 2006, Hezbollah was like a rock star in the Middle East, and this among various kind of communities. To give you only a short example, in the Armenian neighborhood of Aleppo, Aziziyeh, I would see, pictures of Charles Aznavour close to Hassan Nasrallah. He was considered as a resistant. You could also see pictures of Hassan Nasrallah in Egypt, in Cairo, and widely, Hezbollah was perceived as a resistant actor that was able to, if it's not to defeat Israel, to not allow an Israeli victory in Lebanon in 2006. This has changed. This has changed massively. Why? Hezbollah does not have similar popular support, whether in Lebanon or in the region. First of all, in 2008, it used its weaponry against other Lebanese actors by taking over parts of West Beirut militarily and attacking other also regions. In 2011, as I mentioned before, end of 2011, beginning of 2012, it got involved in the Syrian uprising on the side of the Syrian regime to repress massively the Syrian protesters, the various Syrian armed forces, and this before the Salafist jihadist forces started to dominate, if you want, the armed composition of the Syrian opposition armed groups. Also, throughout the years, it has become one of the key political actors with the rest of the ruling class defending the Lebanese sectarian neoliberal political system, as we've seen in the 2019 uprising in Lebanon, the October's uprising, where Hassan Nasrallah sent its supporters and members to repress, people demonstrating in the streets, whether in Beirut or in the south, and accused them of being, basically funded by Western embassies, foreign actors, etc. What protesters reacted: "You're the most funded actor by a foreign actor in Lebanon, by the Islamic Republic of Iran." And similarly, then Iraq and Lebanon, you could hear slogans: "No to US and Saudi Arabia on one side, and no to Iran, and no to Iran on the other side." So no US, no Iran. They wanted a kind of autonomy from both of the actors, and seeing these both actors as actors threatening their countries, or etc. And since 2019 also, also there's been other reasons. Hezbollah is also much more isolated socially among the population, and politically as well. Politically, one of its main allies, the Free Patriotic Movement, which is a Maronite Christian-led political movement led by former Lebanese President Michel Aoun and now Gibran Bassil, is not allied like before with Hezbollah, but more importantly, it's been more and more increasingly isolated socially among the population. We've seen more kind of social tensions between the various Lebanese communities. For example, you had conflict in Khalde, which is in the outskirts of Beirut, between Arab Sunni tribes and Hezbollah. You've seen in the south, in a Druze village 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, 2021, Druze villages stopping armed combatants of Hezbollah that were putting rockets close to their village. And moreover, more importantly, I don't know if you've seen the clashes that occurred in Tayoune, which is a kind of at the separation between Christian and Shia neighborhoods. They've been, harsh tensions with several killed, etc. And we can see that Hezbollah is much more isolated socially and economically. Finally, for a lot of Lebanese people, they cannot sustain a war with the deep economic crisis that is witnessing Lebanon since, since 2019. For all these reasons, Hezbollah is not really willing to start a war. We have to take into consideration these different levels, whether geopolitical, but also nationally. Hezbollah does not want to see a new 2006, meaning the destruction of its massive infrastructures, to be weakened internally, etc., while it doesn't have the similar support. And this is why we can say that there's an unwillingness from Hezbollah to launch a war, and Israel knows it. And this is why it has been pushing more and more various escalations against Lebanon. We have to know that nearly 200 soldiers of Hezbollah has died. More attacks have occurred in the past few weeks against civilians. I was telling you that I was visiting Lebanon. I went to Saida to make interviews with people from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Close by Saida, the city, yesterday, 2 days ago, Ghaziye, which is close to Saida, was bombed by Israel airplanes. We've seen also Hamas leader number 2, Aruri, assassinated in the middle of Beirut, especially in Dahieh, which is considered a Hezbollah controlled neighborhood. This exceeds the so-called rule of engagement, and Israel has been pushing and pushing, knowing that Hezbollah does not want a war. But what I'm scared is, where is the limit? And this we never know the limit. So, and because among the Israeli section of the ruling class, they want to achieve objectives in addition to Gaza, which is pushing Hezbollah soldiers 10 kilometers away from the border, in accordance with Resolution 1701, north to the Litani River. The problem is, Hezbollah, I don't think, is completely against it, but it wants something in exchange. And Israel is not ready to give any kind of guarantees. This is one of the few problems. In conclusion, I think we can say that the Israeli war on Gaza is changing the face of the region, but of the world, of also major political dynamics, global dynamics. We've seen, a normalization process being suspended temporarily, as I was saying, and stakes are much more higher to go forward. But also something I didn't touch upon is, and this is where you have tactical disagreements and not strategic between the US and Israel. The US can see very well that the continuation of the Israeli war on Gaza creates more instability in the regional countries, but also allied countries. It's not a surprise to see that we've seen the first demonstration in Egypt since 10 years since the massacre. Demonstration in Tahrir Square. Following the Israeli war on Gaza, it's been 10 years nearly we haven't seen demonstration in this area. It was on Palestine. Jordan, you see massive demonstrations as well. All these regimes that have peace agreement with Israel, to put it bluntly, don't really care about the Palestinians, but they care about their power. And this is why they're afraid of the continuation of the war. And this is why the US is also want to see a kind of solution on a short term. And actually, they've been rumored. I don't think it's only any more rumors, but Egypt have been, kind of building walls and a location to possibly welcome, Palestinian refugees, but that is enclosed, etc. So this is also something to understand, that the Palestinian issue has always been a way also for population in the region, not only to show their solidarity with the Palestinian, but also to express their discontent and opposition to their own regimes. And if you look back to the 2000s Intifada, you will find in many countries, many activists that started their political kind of activism through the Palestinian issue, through the Intifada in Egypt and Syria, in Lebanon, Jordan, etc. And that were very often playing a key role in the 2011 uprisings. Finally, also is that two last words. Israel's impunity also allows the impunity of the regional countries and states. It's completely linked. And we can see, that the double standard that I don't see, I'm not that old, but I haven't seen, working in the region for the past 20 years, this gap between the population of the region and the rest of the world, especially when talking about the more precisely with so-called Western, standards, liberal standards, etc. Even among liberals in the region, it's very much more difficult to defend this kind of Western liberal standards. And this impunity, therefore, is helping also, in a way, directly or indirectly, regional states and their ruling elites. And maybe one last thing, it's also a problem regarding people that are seeking, a political alternative from, on one side, US-Israeli kind of axis, and on the other side, if you want, the Iranian axis, because both of them are very authoritarian, doesn't have a lot of differences when it comes to political economy. And this climate of war is, if you want, reducing more and more the political alternative space, unfortunately. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to answer questions. And again, most important is that we have a fruitful discussion. Happy to have also criticism and to discuss and debate about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph, very much. Thank you so much. It's a lot of details, but yeah, I completely share this also idea of those Arab countries not really caring in a way, but it's the pressure from the population. In Tunisia, we say that what is happening, the liberation of Palestine is also an opportunity for us to, تصحيح مسار, so the correcting.
Correct.
Yeah,
Exactly.
the process of revolutions that get, and as I said, but at the same time, for instance, in Tunisia, it's Qais is getting popularity because of, the Palestinian cause, because of his, discourse. But yeah, so it's also very much used and instrumentalized as well for different political ambition. I have Frida who raised her hand. Frida. So what we will do is I will take some questions from people who will raise their hands here, and then I'm happy you just talk, and then you can also write in the chat. So we will alternate between people who raise your hand and the chat question. Okay.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. There was a lot to sort of digest because there was a lot that I knew and there was a lot that I didn't know, and yeah, it was fantastic, and it's going to be very much a discussion point, hopefully, with my fellow students in the coming weeks. I actually wanted to discuss a little bit more about Egypt because my mother is Egyptian, and she portrays a lot about what's happening in Egypt. And when talking about some of the Middle Eastern countries not caring by not conducting any action, and I very much agree with that criticism, I actually want to hear your thoughts about what we would call the Western sort of pressure on this, because I don't know much about the economics of the other nations with the West, but I know that Egypt is extremely dependent on the United States for what we would call a yearly allowance, and we're talking a massive amount of money in which the Egyptian economy is dependent on. As an example, with the Egyptian inflation, let's say for about a year and a half ago, one US dollar was around 13 Egyptian pounds. Then about a year ago, it went up to 33, and I believe as of a few days ago, it was up as high as 84 Egyptian pounds per dollar. And from what I'm understanding is that there is pressure from the United States, is that if you act against Israel, we will hold back the money that they're supposedly paying this money to Egypt for furthering their human rights laws and movements overall. So while I understand that there should be solidarity across Middle Eastern countries, at least when I think of Egypt, I also know that there is fear from the government of acting against Israel and against the United States, because the Egyptian economy is so ridiculously dependent on the United States, and with the current recession, it is quite bad. So I guess I want your thoughts on this, and could there be something like this also going on in the other Middle Eastern countries?
Joseph, do you prefer to collect 2-3 questions and answer? Yeah. So Bobby, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks for the very enlightening talk. I agree with pretty much everything you said. Just think about, well, a couple of things. First of all, as you rightly pointed out, the drop in popularity of Hezbollah, both popularly across the board and also within that. But also, Nasrullah's a much awaited speech. I don't speak Arabic, but I looked very carefully at an Al Jazeera translation of that speech. And it seemed to me he basically threw the Palestinians under the bus in that speech. So he I could be wrong. That was my interpretation of it. But my question was more about Saudi Arabia and what I think is the appalling lack of solidarity shown by the Gulf states. At one level, Saudi makes statements about, yes, two-state solution. But then again, there was an Al Jazeera documentary the other day where, because of the ships now being threatened by Yemeni rebels, Saudi Arabia allowed the free passage and protected trucks coming in right from UAE, right through Saudi and onto Israel. I mean, these are supplies to Israel. I mean, on what there was hardly any coverage in the press about this. But I think those are the material realities where I think more and more people should be aware of, which goes beyond exposing the hypocrisy of the Gulf states.
There's also a question in the chat from the very beginning before Joseph started talking about. It's from Michelle Pace about whether decolonial scholarship or an accusation of decolonial scholarship furthering anti-Semitism. So maybe that can also address that with the next answers.
Thank you. Joseph, you can start answering if you want.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all. I'll take the questions in order. Well, what I think is important to understand is that rather than fear, and I will explain myself why, rather than fear of not getting, for example, US support, we should see rather things that they have common interests. Regarding US, ruling elite, government with Egyptian, ruling elite state, and with Israel. I'll explain why. Since the beginning of the US support to Egypt started after the peace agreement with President Anwar al-Sadat, and Egypt became the second most important recipient of US support after Israel. This support has, in its vast majority or quasi totally, being sent to the Egyptian military, okay? After there was, if you look, and therefore it was also a way, I think it was US advisor, or very well-known advisor, unfortunately, and war criminal, Kissinger, that used to say, without Egypt, you cannot do war, and without Syria, you cannot do peace, okay? And when Egypt made peace with Israel, it meant that the most important country in the region, most important Arab country, is not anymore a threat to Israel, okay? And if you noticed, after the 81 peace agreement, you had, obviously it's not the only reason, but it allowed Israel to have much more space to act. You had the invasion, the massive invasion, not like the one in 78, but the massive invasion of South Lebanon and the siege of Beirut, pushing out the PLO in 82 from Beirut to Tunis. And it was the first time the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was not anymore in a neighboring country from Palestine, historic Palestine and Israel. And I'll continue following the peace agreement as well, just as in Jordan in 94, you had the establishment of what is called kind of exclusory or exclusive industrial zone between Israel, private sector, and Egyptian private sector, and same with Jordanian and Israeli private sector with, kind of agreements favoring, the export of particular products to the US or Western market. Similarly, Egypt has benefited from Israeli gas, etc. The trade between. So what I think is important is to see not the fear, but how much they share common interests. And for the Egyptian ruling elite, as I was telling you, Palestinians, when the Egyptian population and more widely in the region, when they speak about Palestine, is the issue of resistance, is the issue, if you want, also of steadfastness, what we call sumud, the issue of political criticism against their own elite. Therefore, this is where you see that there's an opposition. When it comes to the fear of, them possibly acting against Israel, I don't see the Egyptian military ruling elite at all acting against Israel. And one of the other indicators is that without Egyptian collaboration in the siege of Gaza, there would be no siege on the Gaza Strip. And I remember very well because when I went to Gaza in 2012, beginning of 2012, it was also, the tunnels at the time were functioning very well. and actually the Egyptians refused me, so I went through the tunnel in Gaza to make some research, etc. But 6 months, and especially it started 6 months later, but much more importantly, following the coup d'etat in Egypt, most of the tunnels, especially for trade, for human passing, etc., were destroyed by the Egyptian military. So reinforcing the siege again. So all these things show it's not only about a fear about Western, Western states, especially the US, spending, funding to financial support to Egypt. And when they suspended, as you were saying, Frida, I think, they suspended, I think it was a bit less than 200 million out of the billion for violation of human rights. Well, it's suspended. It was suspended, not even completely freeze and stopped. It was suspended. Well, you have still over 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt, and relationship is going very well. And now there are indeed propositions, suggestions, as you were saying, Frida, to allow a higher loan from the IMF regarding the Egyptian economic crisis. And actually, we're witnessing, and this is when you study Lebanon, it's very interesting to see how Egyptian bank started, first of all, to give much higher interest rate into the banks. So there, first of all, you're a bit careful what's happening. And after now, they're cutting on the ability to procure oneself US dollars. So definitely, Egypt is seeing the Palestinian issue as an opportunity to further some kind of interest they would have or possibly loan on the IMF. But also the ruler Sisi has used this opportunity to increase its popularity, saying, we're doing something for the Palestinians, etc. So to answer really to your action is really, I would see, rather than a fear, their common interest. I hope I'm clear, and I really think we should see things like this. They have common interests when it comes to political, military, and economic connections. For the second question, thank you. Well, I don't know if what is interesting is that, first of all, Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, took time for his first speech. And there was a lot of expectations, and actually nothing really came out of it. And he maintained kind of a similar speech until today. But the difference is that he's speaking every 4 days now. Much more, more, I mean, it's much more regular, it's much more regular, showing a fact that he's trying to justify the behavior of the political party to its own popular basis, towards also the Palestinians, also trying to explain different political messages. So the first time he said, for example, this is a complete Palestinian decision, to say, Hezbollah and Iran didn't have anything. And after, because saying, people accuse him of saying, you say this because you don't want to be involved and not supporting that. So afterwards he said, I said it was a Palestinian decision, but we're still involved by saying we support, etc. So trying to justify oneself to its own popular basis, while also sending messages. And when it comes to, obviously, I totally agree with you what you were saying. I also saw the news that basically, if you remember, before the 7th of October, there was this mass map that was published online of this trade route that was basically would be implemented in the near future following the normalization process with Saudi Arabia and Israel. And this is basically what we're witnessing, is that this route coming from India, stopping UAE, going through the Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. And obviously, again, and this is why I was saying that Saudi Arabia knows that it has to deal with a popular opinion. And this is why it's hiding it. And just as it has increased the conditions to reach a normalization process, it has the absolute necessity to hide these kind of deals, while sending messages at the same time to Western states as saying it's still up to the table, this normalization process, especially to the US. For the US, it's very important that this normalization process go forward because of the rivalry with China. basically Israel normalization process with Saudi Arabia would consolidate US inflation regarding the rivalry with China. So no, I totally agree with you. And again, I think we have to see, once again, the common shared interest between these actors. UAE has put it quite bluntly. They want, Israeli technology. They're ready also to provide, and they have been providing necessarily food supplies. They could provide oil, and throughout the region, all these regimes, and this is why I was saying this kind of impunity sharing. A lot of the regional regime have benefited from the technological security advances of Israel. You had Morocco, Saudi Arabia, UAE using Israeli technology to spy on their own opponents or to increase their own security. And actually, UAE kind of security system was well known even before the normalization to be provided by Israel. So, no, what I can say, I totally agree with you. And again, seeing things where these kind of powers share common interests. And the last question, well, I don't know if it's an internal discussion. I'm happy to jump in, but what I can say from my side is that more generally speaking, there's an attempt, and this is why I was very thankful to you, Amira, and I'm feeling we can have this kind of discussion quite openly and in an inclusive way. There's an attempt to criminalize solidarity with Palestine, but also discussion. When I went in France, I was teaching in France November, December, it was nearly impossible to only have, among even political scientists, academics, colleagues, a public discussion about Palestine in universities, which I think is catastrophic. It will only reinforce actually voices that are truly problematic. I'm never going to deny, that there are, anti-Semitic tropes that can be expressed, etc. But the best way to learn about an issue is to speak about it, is to learn about it, and to discuss what is, the key kind of dynamics going on in this kind of conflict, colonization, etc. It's important to say that, for example, and this is why it's important to frame it, as I was saying, a settler colonial dynamic, rather than to say it's the inheritage of a fight between the sons of Abraham, Ismail on one side, and Israel. So, and put it in a religious perspective. This is what is catastrophic. Similarly, I think it's important not to amalgate the criticism of a particular state in the kind of Israel with Judaism. It's two different things. Actually, if we look at history, Zionism as an ideology was a minority among Jewish population until the Nakba, and moreover, I would say until 1967. It was a minority ideology among the Jewish population. And actually many kind of intellectuals or among Eastern Europe Jews or different political movements such as the Bund, which was a leftist kind of trade union / leftist political party, saw the Zionism as a defeatist movement, because instead of fighting anti-Semitism in Europe, they would call to leave, where they were living, to another region. So again, I think it's important to discuss about it and fight very clearly any kind of racism, just as we should fight against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, or any kind of racism. But I don't believe that the best way to do this is to criminalize, any kind of solidarity with Palestine or any kind of discussion, or to amalgate, the criticism of a particular state with racism. So this is where I will stand. I'm happy to answer further on this issue.
I think, Emma, you can read first the question from the chat, and then we have
yes.
Ruby and Florence. Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat, unless the person who wrote it just wants to say it themselves, I'll read it out loud. So the question is, how can civil societies in developed countries from the Northern Hemisphere provide further pressure to demand de-escalation or ceasefire, or more humanitarian aid being allowed to go where needed? We have seen the flaws of the UN in such a situation, for example, in the US veto. Then I can't see the words because there's something over it. But do you have to accept the reality that non-governmental actors, in some examples, might have a more imminent role in providing help in Gaza right now?
So sorry, but I asked the question. You already answered a bit by saying that it's important to have the discussion and important to talk about it, but you may have further points. So I'm interested to hear what you would have to say about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde. We can also collect more questions and then you can answer them. I don't know who was first, Florence or Sebastian. Feel free to, and we have also Bobby as well, right? Florence.
Yeah, I can go. Hello, thank you for your talk, Joseph. About the silence and the silence conversation. I was also thinking not only about the war itself, the ceasefire and so on, but also that it means we don't talk about the future, not least the possible two-state solution. But also more broadly politically, do you see any serious support for that solution? Because there seems to be no political will to stop the current war, while at the same time people come back with, oh, but now we want to talk about a two-state solution. But that seems, very far from each other, because building such a solution is an immense work when we're in a situation where nobody even wants to just stop what is happening right now. And so how can we, relaunch this conversation? Would that be easier to have, to say we want to talk about political rebuilding rather than saying we talk about, as you say, going back to who was there first and who has a right to what?
Thank you, Florence. And Sebastian?
Hi. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, I want to sort of pick your brain about the influence of Saudi Arabia and Iran in this whole question about a sort of any kind of peace resolution. That in being that while they may have reopened what they call diplomatic relations at the moment, they still might have opposing interests in how a eventual peace would end up looking like. As in, if Israel and by extension the U.S. interest is to eliminate Hamas, for instance, or at least politically eliminate them from the region, and Saudi Arabia, for instance, wants to step in as a kind of mediating factor and push for that agenda, this would run sort of against the grain of whatever Iran's agenda in the region might be, I would imagine, considering that Hamas is effectively, well, I don't like the term proxy, but they're an ally of Iran, for sure, even if they're independent. And that would then, by extension, sort of weaken the axis of resistance that Iran has helped build if Hamas was to sort of be sacrificed in this situation. I believe that's also why they've sort of positioned Hezbollah to pressure Israel from the north. Although it's also, I believe also reading that it would not be tenable for Iran to sacrifice Hezbollah in order to preserve Hamas. So while both Saudi Arabia and Iran are sort of pushing for a ceasefire, have called for it, at least, I would imagine at least, that they might have different opinions on how this should materialize. Saudi Arabia from what I believe historically, has shown more support for the Palestinian Authority, whereas Iran has backed Hamas. And so how would the different candidates and who would be the sort of governing authority of a two-state solution how could that sort of wedge point potentially influence Saudi and Iranian relations also in the region? I suppose that's the best way to phrase that question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Joe, you can answer the questions.
Okay, thank you all for these very interesting questions, like the ones before. To come back to Mathilde and her question, the first thing is a ceasefire. Without a ceasefire, you cannot bring help. And one of the things is that the Rafah border, the Egyptian Gaza, is not made for massive humanitarian assistance, contrary to the Israeli Gaza. It's not a border; it's a passage, a transit. And what we know is that prior 7th of October, the assistance that was coming in was very small. It was calculated for the Palestinians to survive, basically. Just for you to know, there were 500 trucks, I think, coming in prior. I think it was on a daily basis. Now it's less than 200. So it's and the needs have only increased massively. I think another thing of the civil society on the north, but also it's the way fundings work, is that you cannot impose your own political perspective that runs in contradiction with your own survival. And this, we've seen some issues, especially in Germany and France, funding to Palestinian NGOs that have been suspended or stopped because Palestinians refuse to follow this kind of political discourse. You can see this, the German political stand regarding 7th of October, etc., has been problematic for a lot of Palestinian NGOs. Some of them has started to refuse. And even in the past, we've seen, for example, women's organization, feminist organization, Palestinian territories had to change some of their discourse because, for example, violence against women, one element that contributed to it was the occupation. And we have stories that it had to be taken off from the report. So the first is, civil society, where I can understand is that you support a particular political brand. If you want a political orientation, for example, if you're a women's rights organization, you will not support an organization that is patriarchal, which, okay, but you don't have to impose, I would say, a particular political perspective that runs against actually the key rights you're fighting for, if that makes sense. And I think this is one thing and after there's a whole discussion we can have, but it's much wider. And I've been working a lot on this regarding the negative dynamics between, civil society in Syria and the way funding works from the West to the UN agencies, etc. But this is a more global problem that we can come back to in another session, I believe. But to just point out this. And another issue, especially when it comes to Gaza, it would be not to suspend the assistance to UNRWA, if you want, who is the biggest UN agency on the ground. First of all, proof have not been delivered still by the Israeli state. Secondly, even though this is true, you don't impose a collective punishment on the whole agency. The main objective is to liquidate the Palestinian refugee right. This is very clear. So these issues is, first of all, maintain and increase the assistance you should give to UNRWA. First issue. Two-state solution. The issue of the two-state solution, how many states or one state, etc. I'll give in two levels, if I may, Florence. First of all, I think the call of the boycott, disinvestment sanction is very good on this. It's about rights and not what the form of the state will take further on. So therefore, it means equality within the historic Palestine. So Palestine 48, what we call today Israel, the end basically of apartheid. It's not me saying this. I am saying this, yes, but it's based on Amnesty reports, Human Rights International, and Palestinian Human Rights Organization for decades. It means the end of the occupation and colonization. Occupation of all territories, including the Golan Heights. The right of return, etc. If you have this, 2 states, 1 state, it's a discussion. So this is my first answer. So I think, first of all, based ourselves on rights, and afterwards, it's the Palestinians and Israeli to decide. But first of all, the issue of Palestinian self-determination that have been denied for more than 75 years old. My own position, I'm more in favor of a one-state solution, and I believe that Palestinian political parties should be, and this is in, you know, in collaboration, discussion with also Palestinian, you know, colleagues or friends, should turn towards a kind of, I don't know if it's the right term, but a civic struggle, because this will include all the Palestinians, meaning refugees from the occupied territories and within historic Palestine 48 Israel, meaning that you fight for, you know, a one-state solution in a perspective that is for equality, redistribution of wealth, social justice, and which include all the Palestinians. Because the problem with the two-state solution that we've seen in the past, the Palestinians of 48 are neglected, no kind of discussion occur for them, as well as the refugees. And I think this is problematic, and this shouldn't be denied. And obviously, we shouldn't stop at a democratic perspective in a one-state solution. Like, for example, the end of apartheid in South Africa did not mean the end of, if you want, form of social apartheid, mean of social discrimination, etc. This has to be rethought as well. There's been, and I think the discussion regarding compensation for Black population in the US is very interesting. Because until today, it's not only about acknowledgement of the slavery on a symbolic aspect, but also on its material aspect until today on Black population. Therefore, compensation needs to happen, redistribution of wealth. And I think similar things should happen with the Palestinians regarding return of, you know, right of return, but more widely in the Palestinians, in what a future state would happen. And obviously, I'm against, you know, the issue of, you know, throwing Israelis to the seas. I believe in one democratic, secular, and a social-oriented state. This is my position. Why is this unrealistic? Well, when people tell me this, I answer, well, is the two-state solution realistic today? And there's no willingness among the Israelis, even population, not only ruling elite, to a two-state solution in the majority. Not even. I would just recall that when you had protests against Netanyahu, it wasn't for democracy, as people were saying, because democracy would mean that you challenge the apartheid state. No, for them it was saying we would, you know, govern better than Netanyahu, our own Israeli apartheid state. They were kicking out Palestinian activists, anti-Zionist activists from the demonstrations. Yeah, and so this is why, you know, only any kind of Palestinian state will have to go through a form of dismantlement of the current Israeli state to form a new structures that have to be decided collectively, but without any forms of discrimination. And maybe we could, after this, find, you know, perceive also a binational state where each kind of, you know, people are recognized. I believe so. And actually, this was one of the solutions proposed by, you know, the PLO in the end of the 60s, and more precisely, the binational state was suggested by the Democratic Front of Liberation of Palestine, that even from the 69, 70 recognized this. So yeah, this is my, and yeah, one thing on the, you know, what something unrealistic, two-state solution. I was saying on the Israeli side, unwilling. And this is why I think there should be a regional kind of movement also regarding Palestine to change the balance of forces. Because also Arab regimes don't want to see this. We have to be clear. They don't want to see this. Another thing is when Israeli withdrew settlements from Gaza, there were 8,000 settlers. For each settler, they needed 3 security services or police personnel. So 24,000. it already created, I don't know if you remember, you were a bit, and many people are a bit younger, but 2005, nearly, civil strife in Israel. So now count 750,000 settlers in the West Bank and Jerusalem. You would mean more than 2 million in the same ratio of police personnel, etc. Is this possible? Well, it's a big discussion, but I don't think so. So this is my answer. And to the last question, there are contradictory interests between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the short term. I don't believe so in the mid and long term. Why so? Because I believe that, I'm not going to call it, I call it the so-called axis of resistance. I don't believe it's an axis of resistance, and an axis that is serving a particular, foreign policy or foreign axis, yes, but not for the resistance, as a liberation of Palestine, for example, or the people of the region. Iran, for the moment, obviously, Iran is happy that there's a suspension of normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel, definitely, because it also runs against the consolidation of US influence, as I explained. But as I was explaining as well, the network of influence of Iran is also used to reach geopolitical on a regional basis and international basis, and to reach a form of recognition. Actually, what is the most important from the ruling elite in Islamic Republic of Iran is to be recognized politically. Going forward with the nuclear negotiation, being recognized as a power that counts in the region and that you have to deal with just as other regional countries. So if this is achieved side by side with a normalization process going forward with Saudi Arabia and Israel and the consolidation, I think the Islamic Republic of Iran won't have any kind of problem. Why I say this? We've seen Iran and the US collaborate in the past on different battlefields. In Afghanistan, they collaborated regarding the Taliban in 2001, etc. In Iraq, following US occupation, there have been also forms of collaboration. And actually, several times, the Iraqi governments that was dominated by pro-Iranian political parties were also supported by the US. Okay? And this means that, they could find agreement in this perspective. I believe so. Because at the end of the day, the end game of Iran is not to liberate Palestine. If there's a solution in which it can find an interest, it will accept it. Similarly, when it comes to Hamas, Hamas has accepted on several occasions, even from the foundation, the two-state solution. They have accepted it. What they don't say is that we recognize directly, even though they implicitly say it through their recognition of various international resolution, etc., we don't explicitly, directly recognize Israel because we've learned basically of the mistakes of the PLO. PLO has given everything and has not getting anything. So they're just learning from the mistakes of the PLO. But if they don't have major differences on the longer strategy from Fatah. Honestly speaking, and even you can find statements from the founder of Hamas in '87 and prior to this, Sheikh Yassin, and other key Hamas leaders since then, saying they would accept a two-state solution around Islamic term that is called hudne, yani long-term truth, etc. So again, I really don't think it's it will be a problem. In addition to this, to my argument regarding Iran, I would remind everyone that Iran actually diminished massively its funding to Hamas when Hamas did not follow its basically kind of axis at the beginning of the Syrian Uprising, where Hamas refused to support expressively, publicly, the Syrian regime and its repression. It left Syria and it lost half of its funding from Iran. So it's also calculated, to make it very clear. After things got better, when a new leadership was elected, especially close to the military leadership and the Gaza leadership, that was closer to the Islamic Republic of Iran compared to Khalid Mishal. Khalid Mishal was closer to the Iranian Hezbollah connection. One last word to say that Hamas also is, just as it's making sometimes similar mistakes than the PLO to depend on authoritarian regimes, and I think was a mistake, is when Khaled Mish'al, former head of the political bureau, I think it was in 2020, supporting kind of the Turkish regime, went on the south of Turkey and saluted the occupation of Turkey of Afrin neighborhood, saying it was a step forward for the Islamic Ummah. And I find this very, honestly, I was like, I wasn't shocked, I wasn't surprised. But for a political party that suffered colonization, etc., saying basically to support, because there's forms of colonization regarding the Turkish state towards the Kurds and occupying forced displacement, very problematic, to say the least. So, yeah, to answer all your questions, I don't think on a longer term, these conflicting interests could be problematic, because the first interest of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its elite is to maintain its power.
So basically, you're saying Palestinians are alone, and those.
No, I think no, because otherwise it would be a very bad note. No, but there was a slogan used by sections of the radical left, of the Palestinian left, in the end of the 60s, that they abandoned it, unfortunately. But was, you used to say even in French, l'air est rouge at the end of the 60s was the new left. You had 68. Etc., is that the road to the liberation of Jerusalem goes through the Arabic capitals, because all the Arab capitals have, blood on their hand. If you don't know, Black September in Jordan, 70, Syrian intervention in Lebanon and in the Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, imprisoning, etc. Egyptian, participating in the siege, etc. And this is why I was saying it's only through the uprisings, I believe, that you could create a balance of forces that is in favor of the Palestinian. But this means a regional perspective. And you had Palestinian groups in the end of 60s, beginning 70s, collaborating with other progressive forces in the region. But they had to face many challenges, unfortunately, and being repressed both by authoritarian regime and by Israel. But I don't think because again, people speak about Algeria. It's not the secular nature colonial state. Palestinians within has to face such a humongous force, and we're seeing it today in Gaza. So alone, it's not possible. But regionally, yes. And one last word, if you remember in 2011, when you had the uprisings happening, beginning of it, the positive side of it, would say, the Palestinian issue came back to the fore. For the first time in decades, you had marches going to the border with historic Palestine, Israel. You had from Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. This was only allowed when you had the regimes being basically challenged. Similarly, you had the first massive demonstration against Israeli embassy in Egypt in 2011, etc., etc. So they're not alone, but it needs, I believe, a new political leadership, new political strategy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if anyone have more question, and please, otherwise. Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you so much.
Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really rich and informing, and also very critical to everything happening around. Thank you so much. Yeah, hope to see you soon to discuss better future for the Arab region, inshallah. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who joined us here today, and see you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.